That protest by the group calling itself the Michigan Conservative Coalition, the so-called gridlock protest, is generating quite a lot of attention. There appears to have been some sort of copycat type protests in other parts of the United States and in Canada as well, in Vancouver, different name, and there doesn't appear to be a sort of gun presence in that protest. Um, but what I'm seeing emerging from this is a sort of, by the way, I reiterate what I said. I think that I had a little bit of an exchange with some of the members there, and the lack of objective thinking, the lack of any sort of reasoned, intelligent argument is glaring. Um, these people are utterly paranoid. And I think when you get a combination of insecure guys with guns, it's quite dangerous. That's what they really are, certainly in the Michigan protests anyway. They think they're great patriots. They're just man children. It's pretty pathetic, actually. But like I say, there were similar protests going on in Vancouver, and here in Britain, we're not totally free from it. You've had the anti-5G crowd who've been burning down mosques, apparently, in parts of Wales and southwest England, under this ridiculous conspiracy theory that 5G is spreading the virus. Um, when it comes to conspiracy theories, I'm not of the school of thought that, oh, they're all rubbish, let's just dismiss them outright. But what I find troubling is how some people will just latch on to the most outlandish ones as gospel truth, and they take any expert opinion as a conspiracy, as a, that you'll hear them say things like so-called expert opinions, so they'll totally disregard scientists. They'll disregard government, but I think that actually comes into an extreme libertarian mindset, an extreme libertarian mindset. Now, on the point about governments, of course, governments lie. I get that. I'm not going to say people need to listen to everything governments say. Our own government hasn't come out squeaky clean in terms of its handling of this. There was a car crash interview with that junior minister in Piers Morgan, where she was smirking throughout the whole interview. She couldn't give the figures on how many people died in care homes. Matt Hancock hasn't come across very well in this regard either. Um, so I don't think any government, or I'll rephrase that, I don't think many governments come out squeaky clean with coronavirus. I think the Chinese government in particular is, its dishonesty is well known. It's well established. But in China, which is a totalitarian state, people don't have the freedom to protest. You have fewer conspiracy theorist type protests. That's the irony. These sort of protests tend to happen in more free societies where the right to protest is a given in normal times. Obviously, with the lockdown, the whole world has changed with this thing. Now, I do think, just as a kind of disclaimer here, I do think it's legitimate to ask where is the timeline for when the lockdown ends. I do think it's legitimate to raise questions about that, as Keir Starmer and the Labour Party are doing in regards of let's have a time frame for coming out of this. I think Keir Starmer's taken a reasonable approach so far of supporting the government's measures, but also saying there needs to be a timescale out of it for lots of reasons, for economic reasons, for normality, for a lot of things. I mean, we do need to take seriously the mental health effect of the lockdown, and also the economic side isn't a trivial thing because with any possible recession, serious recession, that could lead to an increase in mental health problems, suicides. There is a lot of factors at play here. So I'm going to be a bit specific about the sort of protests that are going on in the United States and Canada. Now they're not all absolute templates of one another. So for example, in the Vancouver protests, I didn't see many gun advocates. Canadian gun politics is far less focal than the American gun debate. Canada does have guns. Its gun politics are a bit more pronounced, perhaps, than they are in the UK, but a lot less pronounced than they are in the United States. I would say Canada is somewhere between Britain and the US in that regard. They've certainly got more guns than Britain, but less than the US. In America, the guns come into almost inevitably come into these things because they're explicitly tied to this sort of notion of freedom more so than perhaps anywhere else in the world. So the gun lobby always tie their argument into the argument about freedom. If they don't have their guns, then they're not free. It's pretty pathetic in my opinion. Um, but if we look at the sort of thinking behind extreme libertarianism, and I say libertarianism as opposed to anarchy, because sometimes there's a bit of grey area there. Libertarians would say they're not anarchists in the sense that they're not against control. And I would say that moderate libertarians, I don't agree with it, but I certainly wouldn't dismiss them all as extreme, people like this lot are. But I do think there is an extreme libertarian mindset at play here, which is suspicion of any sort of regulation, suspicion of any sort of expertise in forming the government, suspicion of any sort of requirements that a government makes. It must be some sort of deep state conspiracy. They're just so deeply entrenched in their mindset that any sort of mainstream information they treat with suspicion. Any They love to use these terms mainstream news, which is a term I'm very suspicious of because I think it is very often used by people who flock to Russian state media and to Alex Jones and InfoWars. The way I would see it is the mainstream media certainly deserves its share of criticism, but if you're rejecting mainstream media and you're flocking solely to the likes of InfoWars, you really, really need a reality check. You really need to step back and think, you know, I'm going deeply, I'm going into a rabbit hole here, and I need to just step back and start using common sense. I mean, it's troubling because when they convince themselves that they're victims, when they convince themselves that there's going to be martial law and governments are just doing this because they want to keep people down. I mean, certainly in the case of Boris Johnson, this totally goes against his nature as a politician. As mayor of London, he was socially very liberal. So that order that Johnson made for the lockdown in this country was probably the hardest thing he personally had to do. I don't agree with all the man's politics, far from it. I'm not a Tory, but I do not believe that Boris Johnson is an authoritarian. I really don't believe he is. Some other Tories may have that instinct. I don't believe Boris Johnson does. He was doing it because he had to, because it was a necessary measure that pretty much every government is using. Um, so this idea that governments are just doing it because they're trying to do it as a sneaky way to introduce martial law. Certainly, I think that some authoritarian regimes will be using coronavirus as an excuse for more draconian measures. That can be seen with so-called strongmen and autocratic regimes around the world, from Putin in Russia to Modi in India to Erdogan in Turkey to Duterte in the Philippines. You can see this around the world. Um, but in societies that are traditionally more free and open to begin with, comparatively speaking, firstly, it would be much, much harder for a government to do that because the mechanisms are in place for people to be sufficiently informed to know when that's happening. So, for example, we have healthy debate in this country. We have a healthy level of discussion. Even with the lockdown, people are freely and rigorously debating every aspect of this. You could phone up LBC, offer your opinions. You could go onto Facebook, offer your opinions. So the mechanisms are in place, I would say, to hold, to rein in on the government if they did try that. The problem with these sort of protesters, though, is they're convinced that, I mean, one guy in the Vancouver protest says, "Oh, martial law's already underway." So is he seriously comparing Vancouver in 2020 to Beijing in 1989 or Tehran in 2009? That sort of logic is just ridiculous because they need to consider, well, this is happening all over the world. And there is a deadly pandemic going on. And it's not like the Canadian government saying if you leave your house, it's a shoot to kill policy. If such a thing happened, then people would rightly be raising concerns. I would. But for now, I think people just need to use common sense. And the problem with this extreme libertarian thinking is these people are not being great martyrs who are doing us all a favor by defending freedom. They're actually putting the rest of us at risk. I mean, when you get the 5G people burning down phone masts, I'm not saying they're exactly like the American and Canadian ones, but what they all have in common is they all suspect the big government. They all have this idea that there's some deep state conspiracy, and the government and the media, and they're all in it together because, they want to take away our freedom. Um, I think we should be suspicious of the Chinese government's behavior because of what we know to be the case, because of the pattern that's been going on here, and because the Chinese government's always like that. It's always authoritarian. It's always covering up the truth. That's just the nature of the Chinese regime. In the corridors of power, certainly in the United States, certainly some of those government agencies would have the power to do so. But I think that if you're of the opinion that the lockdown measures are some sort of deep state conspiracy, then you would have to say, well, all the doctors and nurses are part of it. Now, to me, that would be insulting people who are dedicating in many cases, literally their lives on the front line. You'd have to implicate them in the conspiracy because they're urging people to stay at home. So it is healthy to ask the question, okay, there needs to be an exit strategy for when we do end the lockdown. There needs to be reasonable method, for example, the police not abusing their power at this time. So, for example, when that incident happened in Rotherham, there was rightly public anger over that. So the public are not as stupid as the thing that really galls me about these protesters is they think they're more informed than the rest of us. They think that everyone else are just silly sheep following what the government says for the sake of it. No, people are following what the government's asking, not because they want to be slaves of the government, it's because they recognize why it's necessary. And they don't give the rest of the population, they seem to think the rest of us are idiots, and we think they're idiots. So, with this one, I'm going with the majority because the facts speak for themselves. Um, I mean, it's going to get to the point where everyone will know at least one person who's died from the virus. Um, and the way to respond to this is not by being scared, it's not by being paranoid, it's just by using common sense. Common sense is respect the social distancing guidelines, stay at home. It's not authoritarianism, it's a sacrifice. It is certainly not easy. I would love to be able to go to a coffee shop and relax with a nice cup of coffee. I'd love to go to the cinema. But I know it's not going to last forever because the government knows that that would be utterly devastating for the economy. They know that there has to be an exit strategy from this, and there will be. But, Dominic Raab announced the lockdown will be extended. The irony, of course, is the more people who break the regulations, then governments will have no choice but to extend it. Because these idiots gathering together, 30, 40, 50, 100 of them, they are putting the rest of us at risk. Because it's not just them, we all very well say, oh, we'll let them infect each other. But then the police who may have to apprehend them because, for example, they're blocking ambulances getting to hospital, um, then that means the police are down. Then it has a trigger effect because it means that police won't have the numbers to deal with crime. There's still crimes going on. So it, they are not, there's nothing honorable about what these people are doing. They're selfish idiots. And it's very difficult to get them to see reason because when they're that deeply entrenched into believing that everything is part of the big government conspiracy, nothing someone like I says to them would be convincing. So yeah, I don't know what's the best way to deal with them. I mean, I know someone said that in Michigan the governor was too tolerant and she should send in state troopers. That's exactly what this lot would want because it would just vindicate their nonsense. I don't think it would. I think it would actually be justified because, as far as I'm concerned, if they're brandishing weapons at the state capitol, they're insurrectionists. I mean, America's worst domestic terrorist, Timothy McVeigh, had exactly the same mindset. As far as I'm concerned, they're borderline domestic terrorists. They claim the protest peaceful. What's peaceful about brandishing weapons? And what are the weapons for? That's what I would ask them. If you are saying you're peaceful, why the weapons? What's that for? Because you've a right to do it? No, it's clearly intended to intimidate. When these guys come in with their sunglasses and their camouflage fatigues and all the rest of it, I mean, what is the intention there? They're trying to look intimidating, and it's really, I think it's a very dangerous combination. With the Canadian group, obviously they don't have that gun side to them, but they're equally reckless. So really, when I hear people who come out with these sort of things like, "Oh, you need to look into, don't listen to the mainstream media," I've come across a few people in my life who have this mindset, who just treat every single thing as a conspiracy against their personal freedom, everything. I think in a democracy, it is healthy to ask about liberty. It is healthy to ask about the power of the police, etc. But when you're doing it all the time to the point of not using common sense, when you're doing it to the point where you're willfully breaking regulations because you're so obsessed by your notion of freedom, then the rest of the public is not going to sympathize with you. They're going to treat you with the ridicule that you deserve. We'll wrap it up there.